15,000 Canadians sat down with a survey, picked a coffee, and quietly broke something. The Maclean's Coffee Ranker asked respondents to weigh in on the best cup in the country. The result came back. McDonald's coffee ranked ahead of Tim Hortons. Not close behind, ahead. And the number itself isn't the story. 15,000 people is a real sample, not a rounding error or a Reddit thread. The story is what that result means when you sit with it for a second. Tim Hortons didn't just sell coffee. For 40 years, it owned the morning. It owned the commute, the hockey rink, the double-double handed through a frosted window at 6 in the morning. That wasn't brand recognition. That was identity. You didn't choose Tim Hortons the way you choose a restaurant. You chose it the way you choose which highway exit feels like home. And then, 15,000 Canadians asked to choose, pick the burger chain. This wasn't nostalgia confusion or logo loyalty or a weird demographic skew. It was a direct verdict on what was actually in the cup. The burger chain won on product. The institution lost on product. Those are two very different problems with two very different causes, and the gap between them didn't open overnight. Here's the frame that holds this whole story together. One company, sometime around 2010, made $1 billion bet on what Canadians actually want from a commercial space. The other company, sometime around 2014, made a quiet, fatal mistake about what Canadians would permanently accept. The taste test result you just heard is what happens when both of those decisions fully mature. One bet paid off, one didn't. To understand how we got here, go back to 2011 and the moment McDonald's Canada decided to blow up its own restaurants. In 2011, McDonald's Canada announced what it called the largest store-by-store brand transformation in its 44-year Canadian history, roughly $1 billion, more than 1,400 restaurants, every location touched. That number got covered as a renovation story. It wasn't. It was a confession. What McDonald's Canada was actually saying in the language of capital allocation was this: our physical spaces had become a liability. The room people walk into tells them something about the product before they order anything, and what our room was telling them was wrong. Think about what a McDonald's looked like in 2005. Hard plastic seats designed to get uncomfortable after 15 minutes because 15 minutes was all the throughput model needed from you. Fluorescent lighting that made everything look slightly clinical. Bright primary colors. The whole spatial logic of the building said, eat fast, leave faster, don't come back unless you're hungry again. There was no architecture for a second cup of coffee because a second cup required you to want to stay. And nothing about that room made you want to stay. The replacement wasn't just softer chairs, it was a different argument about what the space was for. Leather-style seating, fireplaces in suburban locations, flat screens, wood paneling, brick finishes, free Wi-Fi. The design language wasn't fast food, it was café. And that distinction matters more than it sounds, because design language isn't decoration, it's a promise to the customer about the kind of experience they're about to have. Here's the detail that proves the coffee thesis was poured into the concrete from day one. They installed fireplaces. You don't install a fireplace in a restaurant where you want people to eat and leave. A fireplace is a 45-minute minimum. A fireplace says, order something else, stay warm, come back tomorrow morning. The fireplace is a coffee strategy disguised as interior design. The financial risk was genuine. $1 billion committed before a single cup sold under the new model, before a single customer sat down in a leather chair and decided the room was worth returning to. McDonald's Canada made that bet on a thesis that the Canadian consumer would reward atmosphere, would pay for calm, would choose a lingering room over a throughput box if given an honest option. At the time, that thesis was unproven. What made it worth the risk wasn't blind confidence. It was that Tim Hortons, the brand that should have owned that lingering room forever, was about to hand it over for free. In August 2014, Burger King and Tim Hortons merged into a single holding company called Restaurant Brands International. The deal was worth $12.5 billion US. The firm that engineered it was 3G Capital, a Brazilian-American private equity operation with a very specific, very well-documented philosophy. Find a company with inefficiencies, cut them hard, extract the margin, repeat. That playbook has worked. It worked on Anheuser-Busch InBev. It worked on Kraft Heinz in the early years. On a spreadsheet, 3G Capital looks like a machine that turns bloated brands into lean ones. The problem is that Tim Hortons wasn't bloated, it was beloved, and 3G's tools don't distinguish between fat and muscle. The first cuts were visible inside the franchise system. Royalties went up, franchisee support came down. The volume over quality logic that works fine in a commodity burger chain started getting applied to a coffee brand whose entire value proposition was consistency. Franchisees noticed, some went public. But the move that actually broke the product happened further up the supply chain, away from any camera. For years, Tim Hortons had sourced its coffee through Mother Parkers, an outside roaster working with premium Arabica. Arabica is more expensive, more delicate, and, done right, noticeably better in the cup. After the merger, Tim Hortons shifted roasting in-house and moved toward Robusta, cheaper, heartier, higher in caffeine, and the primary ingredient in instant coffee and budget grocery blends. It's not a subtle downgrade. Anyone who drinks coffee regularly can taste it. Then a rumor started moving through Canadian food media. The story went like this. McDonald's Canada had quietly bought the old Tim's blend from Mother Parkers. That Tim's hadn't just abandoned their recipe, they'd sold it to the competition. Tim Hortons officially denied it. No sale, no transfer, no secret handoff. And there's no documented evidence to contradict that denial. But the rumor spread anyway, not because Canadians are gullible, because the quality gap was real and people could taste it. When the coffee in your cup gets worse at the same time a competitor's gets better, the conspiracy theory writes itself. Perception filled the space the product left empty. McDonald's, for its part, wasn't waiting around for Tim Hortons to recover. McCafé had launched in Canada around 2011, the same year those fireplaces went in. And by the time the merger was closing, the numbers were already moving. McCafé tripled McDonald's coffee sales. It more than doubled their share of the Canadian coffee market. Then they ran free coffee campaigns at a scale that removed every barrier to trial. You didn't have to risk $1 to find out if the cup was better. McDonald's handed it to you and let you decide. McDonald's competed on volume and discount. McCafé competed on quality and access. One of those strategies assumes loyalty is permanent. The other assumes it has to be earned every single morning. The McLean survey told you which assumption was right. So let's stress test the coffee win. Because a better cup and a nicer room explain consumer preference, they don't explain why a Canadian McDonald's feels structurally different from an American one. That gap runs deeper than design choices and roast profiles. It runs into the supply chain, into agricultural policy, into the regulatory machinery that governs what goes into Canadian food before it ever reaches a kitchen. Start with beef. McDonald's Canada sources roughly 85% of its annual food spend, about $1 million, from Canadian suppliers. The beef in Canadian patties comes from ranches in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and it carries federal traceability requirements that American beef doesn't face at the same level. More importantly, those patties contain no artificial fillers and no preservatives, not because McDonald's Canada chose to be virtuous, but because the Canadian system doesn't allow them. The inputs are different because the rules are different. That's not marketing, that's food policy showing up in your lunch. Dairy is where the gap gets harder to ignore. Canada runs a supply-managed system for milk and dairy. Quotas, price controls, domestic production requirements. One direct consequence: artificial growth hormones are illegal in Canadian milk production. They aren't illegal in the United States. So the milk in a Canadian latte and the milk in an American one are not the same product. The regulatory environment produced two different inputs: the cheese on a Canadian burger, the cream in a Canadian coffee. Structurally different, not cosmetically different. Then there's poutine. Poutine. Real Quebec cheese curds, fresh, not processed, with that specific squeak that signals they haven't been sitting on a truck for 3 days. That's not a novelty item on a regional menu. In Quebec, it's a test. Serve it wrong, and the market tells you immediately. McDonald's Canada learned to serve it right, which means they learned that some products in the Canadian market carry cultural weight that standardization can't absorb. The menu shift continued quietly from there. Grilled chicken that actually tastes like chicken. Premium salads with quinoa, and edamame. Croissants and bagels from local bakeries instead of frozen centralized shipments. Each one a small signal that the chain was watching where Canadian tastes were moving and moving with them, rather than hoping loyalty would compensate for stagnation. The logical endpoint arrived in December 2015, a standalone McCafé inside Toronto's Union Station. No fryers, no burgers, coffee, salads, artesian sandwiches, fresh croissants. A second location followed at First Canadian Place in early 2016. The coffee thesis, fully materialized, stripped of the burger chain identity entirely. Now here's the beat most coverage of this story skips. In 2020, a COVID processing bottleneck at the Cargill facility in High River, Alberta, forced McDonald's Canada to temporarily import beef. Angus burgers came off the menu. They admitted it publicly, didn't hide it, and by September 2020 announced a return to 100% Canadian beef. A lesser brand manages that quietly. McDonald's Canada disclosed it and fixed it. That kind of transparency doesn't happen by accident. It happens when a company has spent a decade building a relationship with a market it actually respects. Higher wages help sustain that standard. The Canadian federal minimum sits at $18.15 an hour versus the US federal floor of $7.25. Lower turnover follows from that gap. A crew that's worked the same counter for 2 years understands the rhythm of the room in a way a spreadsheet never will. They know where the rush bunches, which kiosk jams on cold mornings, a regular's order before they finish typing it. That operational steadiness never shows up in a press release. It shows up in whether your coffee arrives correct and your lobby stays calm. And calm, it turns out, is something Canadians rank unusually high. Mintel tracked coffee shop attendance across North America and found that 44% of Canadians frequent coffee shops regularly, against 28% of Americans. That's not a marginal difference you can blame on weather or demographics. It's a structural gap in how two populations relate to commercial space. Canadians use coffee shops the way Europeans use cafés, a place to extend the day, not just fuel it, a spot to open a laptop, hold a meeting, read, think, or just exist without someone clearing your table at the 18-minute mark. Tim Hortons understood this once. The double-double at the hockey rink wasn't just cheap caffeine, it was social ritual. The cup was a reason to stay in the cold and talk to someone. When 3G Capital started optimizing for margin, they didn't just cut costs, they cut the unhurried quality that made the space worth staying in. The room got louder, the product got worse, and the cultural permission to linger quietly expired. McDonald's Canada read that gap and built into it. The renovated interiors weren't just prettier than the old plastic boxes, they were functionally different. Calmer color palettes. Seating that doesn't punish you after 20 minutes. acoustics that don't amplify every tray drop. The design spoke European, which is another way of saying it spoke to what Canadian consumers were already telling researchers they wanted. When the kiosks arrived around 2015, the operational redesign went further than most people noticed. Dedicated pickup zones for delivery couriers, separate flow paths for dine-in customers and bag-and-go orders. This sounds like logistics. It's actually brand protection. The person sitting for 90 minutes with a coffee and a croissant is the proof of concept for everything McDonald's Canada spent a decade building. Let a chaotic delivery surge wreck their experience and the whole thesis collapses. They designed the floor so it couldn't. Tim Hortons, by contrast, let the delivery economy eat the lobby alive. Under margin pressure, the operational investment required to manage that tension never arrived. The stores got messier, the lineups longer, the staff thinner on the ground. The calm Canadians wanted from a coffee space became available at McDonald's and unavailable at Tim Hortons. The market responded accordingly. Community ownership reinforced the gap from another direction. Roughly 80 to 85% of McDonald's Canada restaurants are locally franchised. The person running your nearest location probably lives nearby, sponsors local teams, and has a personal stake in whether the parking lot is clean and the staff are treated well enough to stay. McHappy Day has channeled millions annually into Ronald McDonald House charities, 15 houses and 16 family rooms, supporting more than 25,000 families a year. That's 50 years of local presence, compounding quietly. Tim Hortons built the same equity over decades, then transferred it to a holding company that treated it as a line item. Here's where the analysis gets uncomfortable for anyone who wants this story to have a clean ending. McDonald's Canada injects roughly $4.2 million a day in local economies through wages and domestic purchasing. That figure is a real commitment to the Canadian supply chain, one that produces measurable returns in consumer trust. But that trust is contingent. It holds as long as the company keeps making the decisions that earned it. The moment global standardization wins the internal argument, the stores start drifting toward their American counterparts. The sourcing gets more flexible, the room gets louder, the cup gets cheaper, and the Canadian consumer, who has demonstrated repeatedly that they notice these things, notices again. That's the structural tension underneath the win. American McDonald's runs the opposite model: lowest cost inputs, maximum throughput, global consistency. And that model works in the American market because the regulatory environment supports cheaper inputs. The wage floor doesn't create the same retention dynamic, and the lingering café preference simply isn't as deeply embedded in the culture. Try to import the Canadian playbook south of the border, and you don't get a premium experience. You get a cost structure with no corresponding willingness to pay for it. So the Canadian model isn't universally superior, it's contextually correct. McDonald's read the Canadian consumer accurately and built a system calibrated to what that consumer actually rewards. Tim Hortons read the same consumer and decided loyalty was structural rather than earned, the most expensive assumption a brand can make. One company bet the Canadian market would pay for better. One bet it wouldn't have to. And that pattern, who reads this market correctly versus who assumes it will absorb whatever gets handed to it, isn't a historical curiosity. It's the active question facing every brand with a Canadian footprint right now. McDonald's Canada proved something the global playbook says shouldn't be possible: that a multinational with a standardized logo can win a local market by genuinely respecting what makes that market different, not performing respect, building it into the supply chain, the floor plan, the franchise structure, and the cup. And it proved the inverse just as cleanly. A beloved national brand, 40 years of morning ritual behind it, can lose its grip the moment it decides history is a substitute for quality. It isn't. It never was. The forward question is harder than the win. The premium model holds only as long as the internal argument stays Canadian. Global capital has a gravitational pull towards standardization, and standardization is always cheaper in the short term. The day the sourcing gets looser, the fireplaces come out, the crew turnover climbs back toward American norms, that's the day the McLean survey runs again and the numbers look different. The advantage isn't locked in. It has to be chosen repeatedly against the math that says cheaper is fine. So here's what I want you to think about. Have you crossed the border and felt the difference yourself? The quieter room? The cup that actually tasted like something? Drop that in the comments, because the gap between anecdote and data is where the real argument lives. And the bigger question, does this premium Canadian positioning hold long-term, or does global capital eventually win the internal vote? That's not rhetorical. Drop your read below. If this kind of structural breakdown is useful to you, subscribe. There's more coming. Next video, we open the books on another Canadian name everyone assumes is safe. We find the opposite. Until then, stay sharp.